you for listening to the Australian Anaesthesia Podcast. I'm Dr. Susie New from the Australian Society of Anaesthetists, otherwise known as the ASA, and this is where we talk about all things relevant to anaesthesia in Australia. I hope you've had a good festive season and start to the new year and managed to also have a bit of a break. I also thought we might ease into this year and do a podcast about the podcast. First of all, I'm very grateful to you, our listeners, who've been following along with the podcast and steadily growing in number. I'm also really grateful for all the feedback that I've received from you. I realise that some of you have been with me from the start, way back in early 2020. Yep, that's right, 2020. We are now heading into the fourth year of this podcast. Now, because we've been going for 3 years and because we talk about anything and everything that's related to anaesthesia in Australia, I've created various playlists of the podcast. So in this episode, I'm going to go through how to find them all. Well, maybe not all of them, but most of them. So think of this episode a bit like a treasure hunt or a navigation guide to the podcast. Of course, I'm going to make it easy for you by putting links to everything in the episode notes. Now, speaking of links, I thought I might quickly explain to you how to find them because thanks to Kaylee for your feedback, I realised that not everyone might know this. So the first thing I'm going to assume is that you're listening to this podcast on your favourite podcasting app or via the ASA website. So if you're listening on a podcasting app, be it on your smartphone or another device, then it's usually a matter of clicking on that particular episode and then all the episode notes will come up. So if you're using Apple Podcasts on your smartphone, then the links will usually come up in a different colour. You just click on the link and it'll take you directly to the page. If it's a member-only page, then you'll need to log into the ASA website and then it still should take you to the correct page. If you find any broken links and you feel so inclined, then please feel free to let me know by emailing me on podcast@asa.org.au. All right, if you're listening on the ASA website, then look for the word notes under the podcast that you're listening to, which should be the one that's at the very top. Click on that word notes and then all the notes should come up, as well as all the links that I mentioned. All right, so let's begin our navigation guide of the ASA podcast. So as I mentioned before, you're either listening to this on your podcast app or on the ASA website. If you're on the ASA website, then usually the place where people find it is on the homepage. If you scroll right down to the very bottom, it's a link there. You can just press on that and it takes you to all our publicly available episodes. And notice there that I put the emphasis on publicly available. So the podcast episodes on the ASA homepage, as well as on whatever podcast app you're listening to, will contain all the publicly released episodes, which is from about episode 17 onwards. I think we're up to episode number 60 or something, so certainly the last 40-odd episodes. I'm pretty sure now that this podcast can be found on any podcast app. And if you know, you kind of know. If you're using one of those apps, you're already using it. But if you are curious about wanting to try out another podcast app, and I know people have their different preferences, then you can see a whole range of the buttons for those apps on the bottom of the podcast page on the ASA website. So there's Apple Podcasts, which tends to be the most common one that people are using, but there's also Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Podchaser, Podbean, to name a few. And certainly some of the podcast diehards out there certainly have preferences in which app they use for various functionalities within the apps that I'm not going to go into, but do feel free to have an explore for yourself. Okay, so I mentioned that about the last 40 episodes or so are released publicly. So is it possible to find those early episodes? Well, yes, it is, if you are an ASA member. So the best way to find those is by navigating to the ASA Education Learning Resources page, or as we call it, ASA Ed. So if you go to ASA Ed, you'll see the cover art for the podcast, click on podcast, and you get the same list of publicly available podcasts as you do on the public page, but then underneath that you get all the member-only episodes. All right, so that's the main thing about where to find all the podcast episodes. But as I said earlier, there's been a lot of content over the last 3 years, and I have created playlists of various podcasts that are more focused. So let's go through these in the order that we progress through our career, because the ASA is here to support you throughout your career, from the moment you're contemplating becoming an anaesthetist right through until retirement. If you are considering becoming an anaesthetist and want to know what's involved, or you're trying to get onto the anaesthesia training program and want to improve your chances, then look at the PMET resources page. PMET stands for Pre-Vocational Medical Education and Training, and the link is from the ASA Ed page. You'll find the podcast as well as a video with tips on how to ace your job interviews. You do need to be a member of the ASA to access any of these pages that are from the ASA Ed page, but did you know that you can join the ASA for free if you are a PMET doctor? So hopefully that won't be a barrier for you to access this particular playlist. If you've made it onto the anaesthesia training program and you're looking for some podcasts, then again, head to the ASA Ed page and look for the button that says Trainee Resources. Here you'll find lots of videos and podcasts, mainly on the exams, but we know that there is more to training than exams. So you'll also find podcasts that help you navigate training, such as if you needed to take a break from training, as well as some communication and leadership tips. The next big transition in our careers is from being a trainee to a fully fledged specialist. And there's a lot going on at that time. There's gaining confidence with practicing independently, there's negotiating contracts, and perhaps starting a private practice. Again, I suggest you start at the ASA Ed page and look for the New Fellow Resources button. So there you'll find videos and podcasts to help navigate this stage of your career. Thank you to the many presenters for making these videos, particularly to the hardworking Dr. Michelle Horn. Now, one of the big things that people learn about at this stage is the Relative Value Guide, or the RVG, and how to use it to invoice patients. One thing that's really important to us here at the ASA is that you know how to use the RVG in a way that is compliant with Medicare. And we're frequently meeting with the department on this and having some great two-way conversations about the schedule as well as about being compliant. So there's a stack of podcasts on this area, which is called the Talking Money series. Now, this can be found from the New Fellows Resources page by looking down the right-hand side sidebar menu, or you can find it by going to the ASA Ed page, going to the podcast button, and looking for the Talking Money button. Now, we know that there is more than talking money when it comes to running an anaesthetic practice in Australia. So this podcast is not just about money. We also talk about the professional, economic and business aspects of running an anaesthetic practice and provide you with some tips so that you can focus on the important task of caring for your patients. We are also slowly building up our anaesthesia recipe book. So you know that feeling when you might not have done a particular anaesthetic for a while. Maybe you had an obstetric and then a cardiac fellowship and you're suddenly going back and doing pediatrics or something. And you want a quick recap so that you can be slick and impress everyone with your amazing anaesthesia skills. Well, the anaesthesia recipe book will hopefully fill that gap. It's more a video than a podcast, and there's more recipes on the way. And I want to say a huge, huge thank you to everyone who has contributed or is planning to contribute. The link to the anaesthesia recipe book is from the ASA Ed page. I hope it's becoming clear that the ASA Ed page is a great place to start if you're looking for a specially created podcast playlist for your stage of career, along with a stack of other resources, and also reminding you that you do need to be a member of the ASA to access this page. I've also left some podcast playlists in other locations. One is the ACE website. So ACE stands for Anaesthesia Continuing Education. ACE is a tripartite arrangement between the ASA, the College and the New Zealand Society, and together our three organisations oversee and support the Special Interest Groups, or SIGs. And we are very grateful for the hard work of everyone, particularly from the college there. Now, I have a particular interest in wellbeing, so you'll find a playlist on the wellbeing related topics on the Wellbeing SIG page. I've also been really fortunate in crossing paths with some great leaders in anaesthesia, and I've recorded some really inspiring conversations with them. So these are in a playlist that can be found on the Leadership and Management SIG page. I once learnt in a workshop that once you finish your technical training, so once you've qualified as a specialist anaesthetist, that actually most of your career development is in leadership rather than in whatever technical field that you've trained in. So if you take that thought and want to learn more, then I do suggest listening to that playlist that can be found on the Leadership and Management SIG page. Now, speaking of leadership, we have some very talented anaesthetists amongst us who have branched out and done other things, such as invent new pieces of equipment or develop software to help us in our work. You can find out more about their work by visiting the Innovators and Inventors page on the ASA website. Thank you to those innovative ASA members for chatting with me about their work. You can also find a curated playlist from that webpage. All right, I think that's been a good walk through most of the playlists for the Australian Anaesthesia podcast. There are some other playlists tucked around the place, and we also have some episodes on YouTube, which I won't go into here, except to say that they're around. If you want to find us on YouTube, just look up Australian Society of Anaesthetists and you'll find our channel with videos from our latest conferences as well as the podcast. There's also been some exclusive podcast episodes which have been prepared in the past for select groups, such as presentation and video tips for our National Scientific Congress speakers. Which does remind me, I have had a few people ask me now for advice on how to create a podcast. So I am thinking of making a special podcast which answers all of those questions that have been frequently asked. If you think you'd like to listen to that podcast, then again, email me via podcast@asa.org.au and I'll let you know when it's available. That one again will be one of those exclusive podcasts that won't be published publicly. So to wrap up, if you are listening to a trailer for an episode on your favourite podcast player, and you'll know that because it's only 1 or 2 minutes long, then all you need to do to access the full episode is to follow the link in the episode show notes and log in with your ASA member details. Likewise, if you're looking for any of the links that I mentioned, just tap on the notes button if you're listening on the website, or look for the notes button in your podcast playing app. I think the big take-home message from this podcast is that if you are looking for some resources that are relevant for your particular stage in your career, and I know we're all a bit time pressured and sometimes we want to just get straight to the topics that are of most interest to us, then the ASA Ed page is the best place to start. Thank you to Rianne in ASA headquarters and the fabulous education committee for pulling all of those resources together. And finally, the third take-home message, because I always feel better giving 3 summary messages, is that if you want to share any feedback, ideas, or whatever it is, the best email address is podcast@asa.org.au. It is all gratefully received, positive or otherwise. We love hearing from you. All right, we have some great episodes coming up, less of me talking and more from some amazing experts in the field of anaesthesia and related to the field of anaesthesia. I'm really looking forward to sharing them with you. Until then, stay safe, stay well, and thank you once again for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Australian Anaesthesia Podcast, which can be found on all the major podcast hosting platforms, as well as YouTube. This podcast is produced by the Australian Society of Anaesthetists and hosted by Dr. Susie New with music created by Dr. Mark Seuss. The ASA was formed in 1934, and our vision is for every anaesthetist in Australia to be at their best, providing the highest quality anaesthesia and perioperative care through excellent technical and non-technical skills. We also hope that this means that you are functioning at your best when you're away from work. In this podcast, we have conversations that seek to inform, challenge, and inspire you to keep you performing at your best. Members of the ASA can access full versions of all episodes by logging into the ASA website at asa.org.au. If you are listening on your favourite podcast app, then make sure you look at the episode notes for the direct link to the podcast on the ASA website. Also, feel free to follow or subscribe so that you can receive the latest episodes as we do publish regularly. If you have any questions or feedback, please feel free to email us on podcast@asa.org.au. Thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoyed listening.